He literally said the well was contaminated. This was in 1987. The reason we know that's because he described the date. Pat DeRosa from NC Diener files a self-memo on June 18, 1990, 3 years after Ogren called. Now, Ogren had called Denise Ballou with County Health. He got bumped up to a woman named Robin Purcell. Robin Purcell called Pat DeRosa. Robin Purcell was with Hazardous Waste for NC Diener. Would you believe that 7 days later, NUS or EPA was testing the site to see exactly how bad the contamination had migrated? This is the report. This is the cover sheet. This is for EPA about the CTS of Asheville site. And it says right there, CTS of Asheville, Screening Site Inspection, Phase 2. It talks about how close people live, and it says right here that there are 3,887 people within 1 mile of the plant. In their summary, they said that the surface water pathway was of concern because it was used for fishing, boating, and swimming. That would be the French Broad. There are two bodies of water that either start on the CTS property on Mills Gap Road or traverse it. They were concerned about the impact on the French Broad. Some of the chemicals that they cited are 1,2-dichloroethylene, which is a degradation process of trichloroethylene, and vinyl chloride. Vinyl chloride is the fourth most dangerous compound for humans to come in contact with. They listed the locations, CASWO2. They talked about the groundwater pathway was not of concern. I mean, it was of concern because of the fact that there were approximately 397 wells within 3 miles of the facility. They didn't test the air, although they did say the airway was of a concern because of the 3,887 people living within a mile. They only tested one groundwater source. They went 4,226 feet away. 9 years later, they're going to identify 9 wells within a quarter of a mile to use as monitoring wells. But 9 years earlier, they decided they'd go almost a mile away, and as you can imagine, they got a clean hit, nothing. Then on the last paragraph, they said the on-site exposure pathway is not of concern because the access to the facility is limited by a fence. Now this report doesn't make any sense. Just because there's a fence keeping people off the property doesn't mean that what's on the property can't get through that fence, either through the air, through surface water, through sediment migration. Now, what I want you to understand is that Barry Durand and Aaron Penland and Dave Ogren and Gina Horecki and all these people that have worked so hard on this, when we get their maps, a lot of times we couldn't really make out what they were referring to. CASSO5, and then there's smudge stuff here. We knew that what they were referencing based on the descriptions, like concentrations found in an old pond lagoon area or the convergence of 2 streams. Well, there are the 2 streams. That's easy to find. There are the 2 streams converging. There's the old pond. Here's what we didn't know. This is the first time that Don and Harry or anybody else around here has heard. In 1990, the EPA left that plant, trespassed onto the Rice property, took a sample at the Rice property springs, did not inform the Rices, and withheld that information. It wasn't until last week that the Rices learned for the first time that their property had been sampled here at CASDO2, right there. Here's the fence. Here's what we had concentrated on as far as the 2 streams, the old pond, and there it is, SDO2, right there. 75 feet from Terry Rice's door. Want another example? They left the property, turned down the drive onto Mills Gap Road, turned onto a private driveway, drove down here, took a sample in clear sight, visual, no barrier for line of sight to identify a house, took that sample, left, never came back, never told them anything. They trespassed The Rices were sitting on 1,100 parts per billion of dichloroethylene, again, which is referenced in the paperwork as a degrading process of trichloroethylene. They didn't bother to walk 75 feet to confirm what the EPA had been told by Norman Lewis back in 1980, that no one lived within 5 football fields of that property. The closest neighbor was supposed to be 1,500 feet, and that everybody was on city water. These families were not on city water. They were drawing their water from springs located right here. And nobody bothered to ask them. Now, that whole family's health has been impacted, as has the Robinsons. I want you to hear me clearly when I tell you that conclusion number 4 in the state of North Carolina's public health cancer screening, it states, the Rice family, the Robinson family, could have had their health impacted by up to 11 years of exposure to trichloroethylene in the water that they drank and in the air that they breathed. If you just take this, because if you take this information and understand that in 1999, when we get to that slide, once they test the springs properly and they realize that it's 7,000 times over the maximum, once they're removed from their spring water, this is the date that they say from this point backward, that's the point of exposure. And the state of North Carolina says up to 11 years of exposure. Well, this shaves off 9.5 of those years. What's the impact if they hadn't drank their water for 9.5 more years? There it is. Want another example? How about this aerial? You think that aerials like this aren't available to organizations like the EPA, that they couldn't have looked at an aerial when they looked at CASD-02, which was taken right here, that they couldn't go, are people living in that house? Because there are cars right here. Maybe we should check their water source. And after all, it's only 200 feet from the plant. And keep in mind, right here in 2001, 32 to 34 feet deep, they're going to learn that there's almost 1 million parts per billion of TCE in the soil. This is a disaster that did not need to happen, and they have covered it. Now the question would be, how do they cover it? We need to talk a little bit further about the history of the 1990s.